Okay, does that look good, everybody?
Perfect.
Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is, as punny as it is, dinosaurs. So a lot of the research that I've been doing on and off over the last, oh gosh, I can't believe I'm about to say it's almost 15 years, has actually been looking at injuries and bite marks or damage to dinosaur bones and what we can actually learn about these animals from these kinds of injuries. So how do we actually go through and learn about behavior from a fossil organism? Well, it's one thing if you want to go learn about behavior from a living organism. That's pretty simple. You just go look at living organisms do what they do. And this is something that's been going on in zoology and biology as long as those have been sciences, just animal observation. But when you're dealing with a fossil, I mean, you can stare at your pet rock all day and it's not going to do anything. So we have to find some kind of way to interpret behavior from the remains of an ancient organism where we, in some cases, don't have a modern analog. It's one thing if you want to understand how Pleistocene direwolves behaved, you can look at gray wolves and get an idea, but it's kind of hard to do that with certain groups of dinosaurs. So there's a certain approach to understanding behavior in an ancient organism. It does really pay off to look at what modern organisms are doing, because even though we might not be looking at a phylogenetic or an evolutionary link between organisms, a lot of times nature repeats itself and organisms will occupy the same niche over time. So we can look at some aspects of modern animal behavior, but then we want to also compare that to the fossil record. And again, since fossils aren't doing anything, they're not getting up and moving, we need to look for evidence on the fossil of something that occurred when that organism was still alive. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple examples of this. And I think when we think about dinosaur behavior, one of the first dinosaurs that comes to mind are the pachycephalosaurs. These kind of large-headed ornithischians from the Cretaceous that had this really large inflated frontal parietal dome and a series of horns around the squamosals and also on the nose. The reason these kind of come to mind right away when we think about dinosaur behavior is ask any school child, what did pachycephalosaurs do? If you give them two pachycephalosaur toys, they instantly will start bashing their heads together because we all know that's what these animals did. But really, how do we really know that? Okay, so they have this very, very thick domed skull. And in fact, the first time that headbutting was ever interpreted or ever suggested for these animals was actually in a science fiction story in the early 1970s. So it's kind of a touchy thing where we have to say, okay, well, we have behavior being suggested from something in science fiction, but what do the fossils actually say? So one interesting thing about pachycephalosaurs is there's some very strong evidence for extreme ontogenetic growth. So we have one type of pachycephalosaur in the late Cretaceous, the Hell Creek Formation, that's sometimes it's referred to as Dracorex, and it doesn't have a dome, but it has lots of horns. And then there's the Jamoloch, which is considered to be an intermediate growth stage, and then you get to the full Pachycephalosaurus. I do want to mention that this is not uniformly accepted. There's some folks that still subscribe to there being 3 different types of Pachycephalosaurs or more in the Hell Creek. Others view it as possibly sexual dimorphism or extreme ontogenetic growth, but there's pretty good evidence that the dome is inflating or growing over time. And when I say inflate, I don't want to give the misconception that these domes are hollow and full of air. They're actually solid bone, sometimes up to about 30 centimeters. So these are very, very heavy skulls. It's the equivalent of having a bowling ball on your head covered in spikes. So the function of the dome has been a bit debated. The kind of long-going idea is, well, they butt heads with them. And really, as I mentioned, that's from science fiction. And when you ask most people why they think that, well, what else are the domes for? Well, there have been some other ideas. Species recognition or display. At the same time, though, we look at modern animals today that use extreme cranial ornamentation for display and also for species recognition. They also sometimes use it for combat. So think about white-tailed deer or elk or moose. So if these animals are actually using their domes for some type of antagonistic behavior, if they're using it for combat, we would expect evidence of combat. If you look at a football player's helmet, you can tell how many times they've crashed heads with other football players because the helmets are all beaten up. And we would expect the same kind of thing on Pachycephalosaurus skulls. So the first thing we would want to do in this case is ask what kind of behaviors exist in animals today. Do we see animals today that butt heads? Is this a behavior that animals do? Well, obviously, this is a common thing in most bovids and ungulates. These two Cape buffalo you see at the lower part of the screen, they're not leaning in for the picture. They're actually clashing heads. Bison will rut. I've had the unfortunate experience of being in Custer National Park during rutting season and had a bison crash into our camp. That was exciting. And if you go to East Africa, you'll see impala, which do a really interesting style of fighting with their horns. They actually never make head-to-head contact. They more fence with these things and occasionally stab each other. And of course, bighorn sheep, where they run at each other and they'll crash heads at pretty high contact. So there's a variety of different ways that modern animals use their heads for display, species recognition, and also combat. But do these animals actually get injured when they're engaging in this kind of behavior? So for a study that we did back in 2013 to actually look at this, we looked at a number of bighorn sheep and Dall sheep. These are animals that are known for head striking, and we find lesions all over their skulls, right where the foreheads are crashing into each other. Now, I want to point out that the injuries we're seeing here aren't indentations. It's not from crashing and getting caved in. This is from damage to the bone tissue that turns into an infection such as osteomyelitis. So essentially, they're getting cranial injuries, they're not getting proper health care, and they end up getting this serious infection in their skulls that actually dissolves away part of periosteal surface and the cortical bone itself. So this is something that we do know modern animals do. We can observe it, and we can find what we call an osteological correlate, or a feature in bones that is tied to that behavior. Now we can go to the fossil record and see if we find the same types of osteological correlates in Pachycephalosaurs. And we surveyed 109 Pachycephalosaurid domes. 23% of them showed pathologies. So if you had 100 people in a room and about a quarter of them all had the same kind of injury, there's a good chance that those individuals were engaging in a similar kind of behavior. I also want to point out this wasn't just Pachycephalosaurus. This is on 15 different taxa spanning over 10 million years in the Cretaceous period all around the world. So when you have Pachycephalosaurs in general, these types of injuries are very, very common. Not only that, but where we find these injuries on the domes is very interesting. Pachycephalosaurs are unique among dinosaur fossils, where they're one of the only dinosaurs where most of the time you just find parts of the skull. Any other time when you're digging up a dinosaur skeleton, the skull is like a coveted thing to find. With Pachycephalosaurs, because it's a solid chunk of bone, taphonomically they hold up pretty well. We rarely find postcranial skeletons to Pachys, but we find their frontoparietal domes fairly commonly. And the types of injuries that we're seeing on these, or these lesions we're seeing, are very, very similar to the lesions that we see in modern head-striking animals. So here's an example of Hansusia, which is a type of small upper Cretaceous Pachycephalosaurid from Canada. And we had this CT scanned. We actually broke the CT scanner on it because when you're CT scanning things that are built like bowling balls, it's pretty hard on the machine. But we were able to see, and you can see on the white arrows on the screen, where we have what's called a rarefied zone. So this indicates that where we have these lesions and depressions on the surface of the dome, underneath the surface in the bone, you've got a low density area. And that happens as skull tissue and bone tissue is regrowing. So this was a way of ruling out the possibility that the damage we see to these domes could have been done after the animal died. If it would have happened after the animal died, there'd be no rarefied zone at all. But since we have that, that lets us know this was an osteological active area of the skull when this animal died. So it sustained this injury, and for whatever reason, it passed away as the healing was still going on. So it occurred in life. It occurred in vivo. We also mapped where we find these types of lesions on all of our Pachycephalosaur domes. So we chose this specimen of the Pachycephalosaur called Stegosaurus because it's a really well-known and well-preserved skull. So we used it as a model to plot where we find injuries. And not only where we find injuries, but on what kinds of pachycephalosaurs we see. Some pachycephalosaurs have a dome that's more partial, like it's more swollen in the back than in the front, and other ones have a fully swollen dome all the way around. And what we noticed is when we have partially domed pachycephalosaurs that have injuries, we find them all over the dome. We find them in the front, we find them at the top, we find them in the back, sometimes even the sides. But when we're looking at our large, fully domed pachycephalosaurs, they're always kind of right at the top. They don't spread out nearly as much. So you can see the black dots are much more clustered and the white dots are more scattered. And this could possibly be because it's a broader dome. They're making more of a straight-on contact, while these more peaked or partially domed individuals are hitting each other on other parts of the skull or sustaining damage to other parts of the skull. So this is what we mean by a partially domed versus a fully domed. So our specimen A, which is a Dino-Sores, that would be a partially domed specimen. So the arrow is pointing to the apex, the peak of the dome. Notice it's towards the back. While in specimen C is the pachycephalosaur from Mongolia, Prenocephaly, and that peak is more at the straight top of the dome. And this might play a role in how they would have touched domes or engaged in how those domes actually function with each other. So what can we say about pachycephalosaur behavior by looking at infections on the skulls that we were able to correlate to modern head-striking animals? These injuries occur almost exclusively at the top or the surrounding part of the skull. Now, if these animals are growing their domes through life, this could be related more to growth and ontogeny. It could be a behavior that they're doing one way as a juvenile and a different way as an adult. Another thing that we do see in head-striking animals today. The variety of different types of injuries are so similar to modern head-striking animals. While we can't prove pachycephalosaurs butt heads, we found this to be really convincing evidence that they're doing more than just showing the dome off, that they are engaging in some kind of common interaction that's sustaining damage to the skull. But it doesn't prove the headbutting hypothesis, it just strongly supports it. And this is something we have to be very careful with whenever we're interpreting behavior. We don't want to go too far into describing their day-to-day life, but what kind of information can we tease out? However, one thing we found really interesting was that different size and shape of the dome and the different distribution of those injuries was very reminiscent of what we saw with our modern head-striking animals, where they also sustain injuries in different parts of the skull and body, depending on how they're fighting with each other. So, did all pachycephalosaurs use their heads for the same function? Did they all fight in the same way? Well, if we look at modern animals today, the answer is probably no. For example, bighorn sheep will clash straight into each other head to head. Impala will fence with their horns. Cape buffalo will sideswipe each other in the head, and bison will hit each other wherever they want to. So if we take this kind of model and then we apply it to some hypothetical behaviors in pachycephalosaurs, the clashing that we see in bighorn sheep, we see the injuries in a very similar way to what we saw in our broad-domed pachycephalosaurs like Pachycephalosaurus and Prenocephaly. So perhaps these animals were engaging a little more like bighorn sheep. However, when we look at bison, for example, bison have injuries in various parts of their bodies. They will hit each other in the ribs, in the shoulders, in the arms. I've seen bison skeletons that almost the entire side of the body is broken and infected because they just kept getting T-boned by another bison. Perhaps this is what some of the larger pachycephalosaurs were doing as well, where they get in low and shove each other rather than run at each other from a long distance. Furthermore, if we look at the way goats butt each other in the hips or in the sides or in the ribs, a lot of rib injuries on goats, we might see a similar kind of behavior in our smaller dome pachycephalosaurs, where they're flank butting each other, perhaps hitting each other in the sides. This is why we would love to find more postcranial skeletons of pachycephalosaurs, because we could look for these types of injuries and test this hypothesis. So the moral of that part, as I move on to the next example, is we have to be a little bit careful with what kinds of behaviors, because there's a wide variety that we could be looking at. But if we also want to think about dinosaur behavior, I'd be remiss not to bring up T-Rex, because if you're going to give a talk on dinosaurs and what they did, T-Rex, I think there's a law that T-Rex has to be included at some point. So this is a specimen from the Burpee Museum that we call Jane. Jane's been in the news recently. Dr. Thomas Carr at Carthage College just finished a groundbreaking manuscript on Tyrannosaurus ontogeny. And actually, Dave, I think you and I met on the dig when we were working on excavating Jane, or we just found Jane. So Jane is a subadult or juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex, recently confirmed to be a juvenile or subadult Tyrannosaurus rex. It's fairly complete. If you've never been to the Burpee Museum to see Jane, the next chance you get, I strongly encourage it. What you're looking at with the gray to white on this image actually is what we have versus what's been reconstructed. And everything white is what we actually have of the skeleton. So we have a very, very large proportion of the body of this animal to get a really good idea what a T-Rex of this age actually looked like. And there's Jane on display at the Burpee Museum. It's funny, when we first discovered this, we weren't sure if it was a juvenile T-Rex or if it was the so-called Nanotyrannus. And once we got the thing mounted, it just screams teenager. It's got long legs, it's kind of awkward feet. It just looks like a growing animal. And the histology has confirmed that. Jane was about 12 to 13 years old at the time.
What's happening?
So if we put Jane on a growth curve with other tyrannosaurs, we see that T-Rex grew up very, very quickly, and Jane passed away for whatever reason right before maybe what we could call a really big growth spurt, kind of puberty on steroids. So this animal would have just increased its body mass. So at about 13 years old, it was about 1,000 kilograms, and by 20 years old, it's looking at around 5,000 kilograms. So these animals grew very, very, very quickly. However, while we were paying all this attention to what Jane was, we also noticed that on the left side of Jane's face, we have some extra holes that we don't have on the right side, and that tyrannosaurs shouldn't have. And that's these 4 punctures right here on the maxilla and the nasal, which is the top bone there as well. So we have these 4 kind of coin-shaped slots in a nice little arc, all on the left side of the face. When we actually look at the nasal, that nose, the top nose bone, in dorsal view, looking straight down upon it, you'll notice that there's a prong on the right side of the nasal that's missing on the left, and that was lost in whatever caused this puncture. But I'll also point out that the bone here has been healed up as well as it is. There's no fresh breaks. It's fully what we call cicatricized. So we CT scanned this one again, found that there was continuous cortical bone and periosteal bone covering it. So whatever happened to this tyrannosaur, it lived through it, and it was actually in the process of almost completing the healing. When we look down on top of Jane's skull, we actually find that Jane has a little bit of a crooked face. It bends to the left. We lovingly refer to this as Jane's boxer's nose. She's got this kind of crooked face a little bit, and most of that arc starts right about where those punctures are on the left side of the face. Now, we had to ask, could this have happened after death? Even though we do have the smooth cicatrization of the bones, we do have to rule taphonomy out as a potential. So here, and I apologize for the quality of the photo, but this is an old photo of Jane's skull still in the jacket when we removed it from the field. So the upper dark brown portion that you see is actually the nasal, and the nasal is laying straight down. Now, the left maxilla is laying beneath it, and it's actually laying on its side. Now, that bend that we see in the nasal and we see in the maxilla could be explained by taphonomy, by just warping over time, if those bones were still articulated. But since they're not, that suggests that the warping that we see in the skull had to have occurred before the skull fell apart. So it had to happen when the animal was still alive. So that's the nasal and that's the left maxilla. Both of them have a curvature, but that curvature cannot be explained from burial processes. So we have a crooked nose. We have a series of punctures that are in a nice arcuate line. They're all similar in shape and similar in size. Best interpretation we have for this hypothesis is that this is a bite. Something bit Jane on the face when Jane was still alive, and Jane survived it and healed from it, but with some permanent damage. So now that we have an hypothesis, it's time to test who that perpetrator of the biting could have been. Jane clearly didn't bite themselves on the face, so something had to bite Jane. If we look at the Hell Creek, the late Cretaceous, who are some of the culprits that could have been doing this? We have things like raptors and dromaeosaurs, but their teeth are very, very tiny, and they wouldn't have been able to produce punctures of this size. Adult Tyrannosaurus is one possibility. Crocodiles are another possibility, and then subadult and juvenile Tyrannosaurs are yet another possibility of the three kinds that probably or could have potentially produced a bite such as this. So here's Jane's left maxilla with the nasal and those punctures, and on the right is an adult T-Rex tooth. Now notice the scale bar, these are scaled to the same size. If Jane got bit on the face by an adult T-Rex, there would be no face left. It'd be gone. So we can rule out an adult T-Rex doing this for the simple fact that we still have a skull to look at. The punctures would have been absolutely massive, and it would have completely obliterated Jane's skull. So we can rule out adult T-Rex. So what about crocodiles? Could crocodiles have caused the bite marks that we see on Jane's face? Well, if you look at a crocodile tooth, they're circular in cross-section. They're cone-shaped. And Jane's teeth are a little bit different shaped. But notice that the punctures that we have on Jane's maxilla are elongated. They're elliptical. They're not round. If these were a series of perfectly round punctures, we'd probably be saying crocodile. But the fact that they're elongate, and they're all elongate, suggests that we can rule crocodiles out as the biting perpetrator as well.
Wait,
this up here, where my fingernail is.
So that leaves subadult Tyrannosaurus rex. In other words, something just like Jane. And when we actually look at Jane's maxilla and we line it up with those punctures, they line up perfectly. And again, Jane couldn't have bitten herself on the face. And where that dotted line is, that's indicating where sometimes a tooth is lost. So it's a certain way that dinosaurs lost and replaced their teeth. They lose every other one during a replacement cycle. So sometimes they have all three, and sometimes they're missing one that's in the process of growing in. So the fact that the shape of the punctures and the spacing of the punctures is the same as Jane's own teeth, we concluded that the most parsimonious explanation for this is that Jane was bitten on the face by another tyrannosaur of approximately the same age and the same size and survived this injury.
When she was younger.
So what would we expect from this? We would expect a pattern of the injuries that would be able to line up like a bite mark. We would expect evidence of healing if it happened in life and didn't result in death. And now we have to go and look at, do modern animals behave like this as well? Specifically, it would help if we could find this in archosaurs, in modern day birds or crocodiles. Birds don't have teeth, so that makes it a little difficult, though they do peck each other on the face quite a lot. So let's look at crocodiles. And it turns out alligators and crocodiles bite each other on the skulls a lot, and they leave damage a lot, just like what you see here. And usually these are aggressive territorial confrontations. It's not necessarily a mating ritual or anything in particular. Crocodilians will fight over space, they'll fight over food, they'll fight over mating privileges, they'll fight over just about anything. I've seen caimans swim up at each other and just decide to start thrashing each other. I have no idea what they were fighting about. They sat perfectly still for 35 minutes and then decided to start fighting. So they fight for a variety of reasons, but they leave these circular, patterned puncture marks on the skulls. So if an animal is getting bit by what we call a conspecific, an animal of its own species, it's going to leave teeth marks just like it would have left itself. Not only that, but when crocodiles do bite each other on the faces and survive those injuries, it's not uncommon for them to have some deformations to the face. So here's a Crocodilus acutus, a saltwater crocodile, and you can see that it's got a little bit of a skewed jaw. And that's due to an injury that it sustained when it was much younger. So it's got a little bit of a cross bite. Its nose is a bit crooked, and its lower jaw is a bit crooked. And this is from an injury it sustained when it was younger, and it grew up and it held on to this injury for the remainder of its life. So what does the evidence suggest in this case? Well, we have similar types of punctures from conspecific bites in alligators and crocodiles. And we see a similar type of osteological pattern on this specimen of a juvenile tyrannosaur. We see that those kind of bites result in deformed skull features in crocodilians, and we see deformed skull features in the same juvenile tyrannosaur right where that bite took place. So when we look at face biting in teenage T-Rex, it's something that, we only have a few specimens of juvenile tyrannosaurs, so it's hard to say how commonly they did this. However, when we look at adult Tyrannosaurus rex, they're very, very commonly bitten up by other adult tyrannosaurs. So this seems to be a behavior that not just the adults did, but it's something that juveniles did as well. And it's the same kind of thing we see with crocodilians. When they start getting around sexual maturity, they start engaging in much more aggressive interactions with each other. So tyrannosaurs may have been doing something very, very similar. But there's implications for this. It means that juveniles at least sometimes fought amongst themselves. It means that sometimes they were interacting with each other. They weren't exclusively rogue. And that at 10, 12, maybe up to 13 years old, tyrannosaurs were capable of inflicting pretty severe damage to each other. I mean, if you look at two dogs or wolves fight, they'll bite each other on the face, but they rarely actually puncture bone. They might scratch each other or bite through the skin, and then they'll make a noise and they'll back off, because even if it's aggressive behavior, they don't have that power to actually puncture the skull. Seeing a teenage T-Rex take its teeth and put them through another skull indicates a pretty severe amount of power in the jaws of even a juvenile animal. Again, we can't be certain what caused this fight. We don't know if they were siblings. We don't know for certain if we're looking at males or females. We don't know if it was fighting over mates. We don't know. We just know that these animals were interacting in an aggressive way, and it left damage to the skull. And that damage is very similar to what we see in crocodiles, but also in adult T-Rex. So here's an artist's reconstruction we had of what the bites on Jane being the one on the right. We don't know what happened to the individual on the left, how that puncture would have happened. As you can see, it would have been a pretty serious bite. This isn't just scratching the skin. And we also had an artist reconstruct exactly how these animals may have looked while doing that. But wait, there's more. In 2007, I led a crew from Northern Illinois University back to the Hill Creek Formation, very close to where we found Jane. And we were prospecting around. We ended up coming across a very scrappy partial hadrosaur skeleton, an Edmontosaurus, one of our large duck-billed dinosaurs from the late Cretaceous. And we named the specimen Constantine after one of our volunteers' last name. And so the Constantine specimen, there's not a lot to it. In fact, we have essentially a pelvis, a couple of rotten dorsal vertebrae, and a couple of caudal vertebrae. But what's interesting is the skeleton, or what's left of it, was laying in a sand channel, in a sand facies, with a mudstone facies on top of it. So essentially it was laying on a point bar that later became a floodplain. And you can actually see where the bone, in some cases, has been sheared off by that erosion that was taking place when it was sitting in this channel. Okay. So we don't have a lot from this specimen, but what was very interesting is the two best preserved bones are numbers 6 and 7, which you see up in kind of the center left. These two proximal caudal vertebrae. So essentially, these are the first two vertebrae of the tail. So this is kind of part of the dino's butt. Okay, we found that. And those are the best preserved bones that we have. And actually, despite finding this in 2007, we're still working on prepping it, because most of the skeleton or most of the hips were in the weathering zone of this sand. And as a result, it's very, very slow going and preparing this. The bone is very, very crumbly. So there's the sacrum that we found. It looks nice, but I'm reluctant to do much touching of it because it's very, very crumbly.
Good, buddy.
However, when we look at those two really nice preserved tail vertebrae, vertebrae number 1 has on the bottom surface, the ventral surface of it, has some very familiar looking puncture marks, very similar to what we saw on Jane's face. So what we did with this is actually painted that bone with silicone, with rubber. And then we peeled it off so we could actually get an idea of what those punctures looked like as a negative. And lo and behold, they look exactly like a 12-year-old Tyrannosaurus rex tooth. And they're spaced the same way that Jane's maxillary teeth are spaced. They're linear and V-shaped punctures, what you would expect from a large theropod dinosaur bite. They puncture down about 5 millimeters, so they're not really, really deep. But then again, this is a part of the body that would have had a lot of muscle around it if it was a recent kill or a recent scavenge. And so you can imagine an animal biting down on the tail, having to go through skin and muscle and all of this tissue and nicking the bone, actually embedding the teeth a bit into it. So we interpret these as a feeding trace. There's nothing to suggest this was a kill. It's on the bottom of the hips, essentially, the bottom of the tail. It'd be kind of hard for a Tyrannosaur to get under there. So this animal was probably lying on its side when this feeding trace was made, when this bite was made.
I was going to start reading.
But again, the spacing of that dentition, if we use our silicone peel as a model, very similar to an 11, 12 to 13-year-old Tyrannosaurus rex, something of Jane's size. I want to go on record. I'm not saying Jane did this. That'd be really cool, but we have no evidence of knowing that. But it was possibly another Tyrannosaur of similar age and size. And we actually spaced apart. We measured the distance between the crowns of our punctures here. And we measured the dimensions of what these teeth would have looked like as they made that. And we actually found that the lower jaw of Jane, the teeth are spaced about 43 millimeters apart. The maxilla are about 68 millimeters, and these punctures are about 64 millimeters. So we concluded that these punctures were probably done with the upper teeth and not the lower teeth. So that means the animal had to have been laying on its side for the upper jaw, for the maxilla to actually puncture the underside of this animal's tail. So this is a mock-up. We laser scanned the Jane skull and our vertebrae specimens and oriented them how they would have had to be for this bite to take place. And those teeth, it's an amazing thing. You can take that vertebra, you can take Jane's maxilla and literally fit the teeth right in those holes. It's incredible. So from this, we can interpret that somehow this Edmontosaur, this hadrosaur skeleton, died, and it was fed upon by a juvenile Tyrannosaur that was approximately 11, 12, or 13 years old. And we base this on correlation of bite marks in the maxilla. This carcass is exposed for a considerable period of time. We have evidence of that in the case that a lot of these bones are eroded prior to burial. They're sheared and concreted, and the type of facies that it's in is buried in a channel fill. So some of these remains may have been scattered fluvially by the river. However, the sacral, those lower dorsals and the proximal caudals all stayed in association. So there's a lot of tissue and a lot of ligament holding things together there. So this may have just been the last parts to finally fall apart, and the feeding by this Tyrannosaur may have contributed to that. But what I want to be careful of here is telling a just so story. Like, so what? A Tyrannosaur chewed on something. That's really not that uncommon. It's cool to find a juvenile that's done it, but it's not that uncommon to find a bitten Tyrannosaur, a bone bitten by a T-Rex. In fact, we nickname them Rex biscuits when we find them in the field. T-Rex like to chew on things, and T-Rex had very, very powerful jaws to crush bone when it was an adult. But what can bite marks really tell us? Well, if we think about it, so far I've shown some evidence of what bite marks look like when they're in very dense skull bone from a juvenile T-Rex, and what they look like in rather soft, spongy bone of a vertebra from a juvenile T-Rex. And if we consider those two examples, turns out bite marks can tell us a lot about how these animals live. So this is all pretty new. We've actually started doing some actualistic studies on bite marks in juvenile T-Rex. So we took the Jane skull once again and we laser scanned it, and I isolated a 3D model of one of the maxillary teeth. I then had that digital model printed in cobalt, which was a really fun order to put in with a company that does dental reconstructions. Like, yeah, I'd like you to make a juvenile T-Rex tooth out of cobalt. And we loaded it up to a mechanical load press with my colleague, Dr. Jack Singh from Buffalo, New York. And we took some cow bones and spent the weekend stabbing them with a cobalt tooth. And we also made videos of it. like this. See if it's going to play it again. Oh, one more time. So we spent the weekend puncturing fresh cow bones to trying to replicate some of these bites that we've been seeing on Jane and on Constantine. Whoops. Okay. And then we took the bones that we bit and we CT scanned them. And the reason we did that is we wanted to measure how thick the cortical bone, the dense outer surface of bone, was on the various spots that we bit all of these cow bones, mostly humeri, but a couple of radius and ulna specimens as well. Okay. So the color coding that you're seeing with those dots correlates to different thicknesses or thinnesses of that outer cortical bone, because the hadrosaur, Constantine, was bitten in a place where the cortical bone is very, very thin. Jane's skull is much thicker. The bone is much more dense. So if we want to figure out what can these bite marks tell us, they can tell us something about how strong of a bite a 13-year-old T-Rex had. So as we were puncturing these, it wasn't just making stabbing motions. We were recording the newtons of force required to puncture and replicate these injuries and these traces.
So what different colors?
So the results that we're looking at, and this is pretty preliminary, but if we look at the cortical thicknesses between 1 to 3 millimeters, our hadrosaur vertebra falls in that category. We're looking at about 3,500 newtons of force. Now, Jane's maxilla was about 7 millimeters in density, so that falls between our 6.1 and 9 millimeter cortical thickness category, and there we're looking at between 5,000 and 6,000 newtons. This is a bite force equivalent to a very large full-grown spotted hyena and a hippopotamus. So that just gives us a ballpark, a minimum and a maximum of what kind of force this animal had at 12 years old. And as it continued to grow up, that bite force continued to grow as well. So we know that adult T-Rex engaged in what we call osteophagy. They would actually bite and crush bones, and the bone would essentially splinter, and they'd swallow it. We know that because we've also found coprolites from T-Rex that have partially digested shards of bone in it. A T-Rex the age of Jane, around 12 to 13 years old, wasn't capable of doing that yet. But what these results tell us is that they were starting to try. They had the capabilities of still damaging bone pretty severely, but they hadn't quite yet gotten to the point where they could crush that. So that's going to be happening later on in their ontogeny. So this is some pretty new stuff that we've done, kind of tying together a couple of these different projects. So to kind of wrap things up, what can injuries in dinosaur bones or feeding traces tell us? Well, when we're looking at specifically pathologies, lesions or infections, they can give us some vague behaviors. If it's a bite mark, it can suggest who did the biting, how, and now we're getting able to tease out some actualistic information on what type of force was required to do that, so we can breathe a little bit of life back into these animals. Or in the case of disease, like we saw with our pachycephalosaurs, it can suggest areas where bones were more commonly infected. But what we really need for this is a large sample size. If you have just one specimen that shows this, it's kind of a just so story. But if you can show a pattern among a population, even a fossil population, it can give a more clear picture of possibly what these animals were doing. We also need to be careful because any type of interpretation of behavior in a fossil organism is subject to arm waving and going too far in trying to set up details of how these animals were interacting that we just don't have evidence for. Most of these paleopathologies are this. They're just so stories. And there's a lot in the literature, and I'm not saying that they're not important, but we have to be careful not to interpret too much from a single individual specimen. We need living animals to study. We need to have lots of fossils, and we need to understand more about how modern animals behave. And one of the things that I've really been surprised about in doing these types of research projects and then going back to the modern and the extant literature on what living animals do is how we have animals alive today that we still don't know how they function. For example, the cassowary with its amazing crest, biologists still can't agree on what they actually use that thing for. So we have to be a little bit careful with some of these interpretations, especially when there's something really weird like cranial ornamentation. But the best thing we do is we need lots of fossils, so we have things to compare to. The more fossils we have, the better chance we are of finding injuries on those as well. And we also have to be careful not to suggest specific behaviors. It was kind of funny when we published our paper on the intraspecific bite marks on Jane's face. The popular press picked it up, which is always great, but all of a sudden the newspapers were saying that we found evidence of sibling rivalry. And we said nothing about that in the paper. I don't know who bit Jane on the face. I just know it was another tyrannosaur, but I don't know if it was a brother, a sister, or what. And so, yeah, we kind of be careful with that. We can't get too specific in telling these kinds of stories, but it can give us a lot of information about how they may have interacted in their environments and in their ecosystems. A lot of people have actually helped with all of these research projects over the years. A lot of these projects were actually done by students. My student Colin Dishler worked with me on Pachycephalosaurs. Carol Bagalki worked with me on Pachycephalosaur taphonomy. A lot of the funding also with this came through the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh Faculty Development Program and the Dinosaur Research Institute in Alberta. Hospitals have been really great in this. Dinosaurs get amazing healthcare today. You can take dinosaur bones to a hospital and say, well, you CT scan this, and they think it's cool, so they'll do it. And so we had help from Drs. Ewan Wolf and Christopher Vittori, Nicholas Longrich, who helped out with the Pachycephalosaur stuff. And then a lot of our Tyrannosaur work also was in collaboration with the Burpee Museum in Rockford with Scott Williams, who's now at Museum of the Rockies. And I also want to give a very special thanks to a former UW Oshkosh art student, Ryan Steiskell, who did the illustrations of the Pachycephalosaurs headbutting in a variety of different ways. He did this as like a senior project for this study, and it made it into the publication. So he just did for somebody who had never done any paleo illustrations before, his first try was absolutely incredible. So I still tip my hat to Ryan after all these years for doing that work. So I guess I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. And I want to thank you once again for inviting me and for letting me talk about how dinosaurs hurt themselves. So,
I got a question.
Sure.
What about the ceratopsian, like the triceratops? Have you studied their bones or damage?
So there have been a couple of studies looking at similar types of damage to ceratopsians. In fact, the way we approached our Pachycephalosaur study was based exactly on a few manuscripts that had done the same thing with ceratopsians, and they found very similar, like where Triceratops shows horn punctures is different than where Centrosaurus or Chasmosaurus has those punctures. And actually what we're slowly working on now is looking at postcrania of ceratopsians. Everybody always focuses on heads, but if we look at the skeletons of ceratopsians, the preliminary data that we have for that as well indicates that, yes, Triceratops, for example, was getting injured in places that we don't see in Centrosaurus or Chasmosaurus. So it's a very similar pattern there too.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
I was wondering about disease and the, if I understand, when it comes to reptiles, they have a high occurrence where if they do have an injury that they can heal quickly. Do you see any disease where these puncture wounds are?
It's hard to gauge how quickly these animals are, because when you say reptiles and how quickly they heal, I assume you're referring to like lizards, for example, which do heal pretty quickly. That's a whole separate group of reptile, the Lepidosaurs. Archosaurs, when we look at birds and crocodiles and dinosaurs, kind of fall right in between on that family tree. Birds being a type of dinosaur. It's pretty different. Crocodiles and birds heal very, very differently, and they can get different types of diseases. So when we start getting into possibilities of specific diseases, we have to be very careful, because a theropod dinosaur may have some diseases that are kind of more bird-like, and there's some evidence of that. But then we see some that also look very crocodilian, and the way those animals respond to that is quite different. So we've been able to look at some of that, but with extreme caution.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, one more then.
Sure.
With the serrations of T-Rex, I was always on the understanding that they might have harbored like a bacteria type of thing, like with the Komodo dragon type. Do you agree on that? You ever heard of? You ever hear?
I've heard of that one, and I think it's a fascinating idea. I don't know how we test it. That's always been my biggest hesitation with that idea. It's certainly plausible, absolutely, because there's Komodo dragons actually have modified that as a way of eating today. I don't know how we would test that in Tyrannosaurs. As far as how the serrations work, because actually there are other theropods that have larger serrations in compared to the size of the tooth than Tyrannosaurs. Tyrannosaurs have massive serrations. They have massive teeth when they get older. But if you look at actually things like troodons, these very small theropods from the late Cretaceous, they have tiny teeth, but they have massive serrations on them that are proportionally larger than you'd see on T-Rex. I think more of that is probably diet and how they're slicing. With T-Rex teeth, as T-Rex teeth grow, they start out very narrow, and then as they get bigger, the teeth become almost rectangular in shape. And if you look straight down the crown of an adult T-Rex tooth, there's a serration in the front of the tooth and the back of the tooth, and they actually rotate. They twist around. And what that's equivalent to is when it punctures its prey, it opens up that wound. So the way adult T-Rexes are feeding, essentially they're just puncturing and pulling and crushing. I don't think they would have needed to have some kind of an infectious saliva.
Long a tooth.
If an adult Rex bit something, it's probably close to
the tooth. The top is this way.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions for Joe? If not, a virtual applause.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much. That's a great presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer if you ever want to email me. Oh, somebody does have a question here about rotating tooth. So, hold on one second. I actually do have a visual aid. So, here's the cobalt tooth that we use in our study. It's clean. But if you look at it up close, you can see here's one line where there would have been serrations. And on the back, it starts here at the top and it rotates around the side. Now, this is on a Jane-sized animal. On an adult T-Rex, it's even larger. It's even wider. So imagine if you took a steak and you took a steak knife and you plunged it into that steak knife and pulled it out. That wound is going to open and close right back up.
Right.
When you have a serration line that twists, that's the equivalent of twisting that knife on the way in. Anyway, now T-Rex teeth aren't twisting, but the cutting edge is rotating around.
It's like the triangular bayonet.
Exactly. And so it's opening up that wound even more. And so a bite from an adult T-Rex, especially because when you look at where they're biting things like Triceratops, it's usually on the pelvis, which is probably an immobilization. Bite, crush, it's done. And so I don't think they necessarily would have needed to have all of the infection and stuff like that. It's possible, certainly it's possible, but always have to be a little bit cautious with that. I personally don't think they would have needed it. I think if you got bit by a T-Rex, infection would probably be the last of your worries.
That's the guy's web.
Oh, okay.
Ritual.
Yeah, I have.
I think I remember reading a few years ago that didn't they find a tooth embedded in a tail?
Yeah, there was a Tyrannosaur tooth crown embedded in the about halfway point on the tail of an Edmontosaurus, and it grew over it. There's a large bony callus that grew up over that crown. So the whole idea of T-Rex was a strict scavenger. I'm like, well, maybe it thought that hadrosaur was dead, and it wasn't. I doubt it. I think these animals probably did go after prey. But if you have a dead carcass there, why are you going to ignore it? They're going to eat that too. So, something we see with modern scavengers today. For years, hyenas were thought to be scavengers, and they kill quite a lot. And they will scavenge too, and lions will scavenge as well because it's a free meal. So, there is good evidence that these animals were going after prey, and sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. When we get a situation like the Constantine site, we have to be very careful. We really debated, is there any evidence here that it killed this animal? And you figure a Jane-sized T-Rex was about 18 feet long. This Edmontosaurus, full grown, would have been about 35, 40 feet long. There's no way an 18-foot little Tyrannosaur brought down an animal that big. So it probably stumbled across a carcass and said, hey, free lunch.
And then that injury on Jane, could that have been like they're feeding on the same animal and kind of biting at each other to...
That's certainly plausible. One thing we're trying to do with this current study, with the actualistic experiment, is consider speed into it. There's been a lot of studies done on Tyrannosaur bite force, but they never pay attention to speed. So we ran our experiments at different puncture speeds. We lowered that tooth into the bone very slowly, and then again very quickly, and we looked at how the force was different with each. And as you might guess, when you hammer it down really fast, it doesn't require as many newtons, right? And then I've spent way more time watching YouTube videos of crocodiles fighting each other than I'd like to admit. And what I've noticed is when they're going to, let's say, a dead hippo, crocodiles swim up or walk up to it, and they're by themselves, they will bite onto it pretty gently to get a grip, and then they cramp down to rip that meat off. But if you have a bunch of crocodiles and they're fighting over the same meat, they will head slap each other really quickly. So I'm hypothesizing that the speed at which our small Tyrannosaur would have chewed on the Edmontosaur was much slower than whatever happened to Jane. So it's likely that for whatever reason, that was a hatchet to the face. That probably wasn't okay, I'm going to bite now, and now I'm going to clamp. It was probably a quick puncture motion, similar to what we see actually in crocodile behavior today.
Another question? Is it possible?
Sure.
I remember one time at a meeting talking to Robert Bacher, and it was a painting in front of us with the two pachycephalosaurs hitting one another, and I looked at him and I go, "Well, what do you think?" And he was talking about the neck vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae, being like shock absorbers. Did you ever come across anything like that? Did you keep that?
I've heard Bob's argument for that, and we do have a few specimens where we have cervical vertebrae. And what is interesting about pachycephalosaurs is the way that their necks articulate to their skulls. When they lower their head, the spine is nice and straight, which is not true for theropod dinosaurs. In the same way, it's not true for ceratopsians. Whether that makes a good shock absorber, I'm not sure, because those vertebrae are pretty small. But then again, they are on things like bighorn deer or bighorn sheep and on white-tailed deer. The vertebrae are not as big and massive as you'd think. So it's possible. What I do think is interesting, though, is if you look at the skulls of pachycephalosaurs and you look at a technique known as finite element modeling, where they digitize and they CT scan these skulls, and then they make a color map of where the densities are different throughout the skull. And then they can digitally whack these things and see how the energy dissipates through the skull. Okay, this was a study that was done back in, I think, 2009 by my colleague Eric Snively and his students. So they laser scanned a bunch of pachycephalosaur skulls and they digitally whacked them to see how the energy would dissipate. And then they did the same thing with skulls of modern head-striking animals like giraffe, duikers, bighorn sheep. And what they found is that when giraffe or bighorn sheep butt heads today, it rattles their brains. Like that energy goes straight to the brain cavity, and they're dazed for a bit after that. But when you look at a Pachycephalosaur skull, the energy dissipates through these radiating structures in the dome, and it never touches the brain. So if Pachycephalosaurs aren't butting heads, they're beautifully structured to do it. They're getting injuries in the places we would expect them to do it. They have the hardware we would expect them to do it. We can't prove it, but I don't know how much closer we can get.
Once again, thank you.
Sure.
He's on a rocking chair.
I know. It's like he's rocking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I am.
Whose job is it to turn people off? Dave's?
It's Dave or Jeff.
It's Jeff. It's not me.
Yeah, I'm the ESCONI host. So, once again, fantastic discussion, and thanks very much for presenting for this for our first virtual. This is really really exciting to come through, and I guess at this point, just one last round, just to see if there's any other questions for Joe. And once we're done with questions, that'll be the end of our presentation. We will be sending out a questionnaire just to see, get feedback from our members in that attended in that. If you do see that, please respond to that. We'd like to continue this and build on this, learn on this. So please watch for that. And thanks everybody for attending. This is really exciting. And thank you, Joe, for the great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks a lot. Yes.
Thank you, Joe.
Very much.
Nice to see you.
Thanks, Joe.
You too.
Awesome.
Thank you. Very
Stay
good.
healthy, everyone.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.